um, welcome to March 23rd, a Unify call, and let's get started here today. I'm Daniel Stein, one of the co-founders of Stewards of Change, and what I wanted to do is, again, just the collegiality of the group is for folks who are new to the group, just to say hello, kind of where you hail from, just a few words, make it kind of quick. I know we have a bunch of new people today, so that's wonderful. If you can turn on your cameras, it makes it a little cozier, especially when you're introducing yourself, or if you can just stay on, that makes it a little more personal on the calls here. So thanks everyone. And Patrick, one of our key speakers, why don't I just ask you to say hello and just a little quick intro, and then I'll just pick people randomly here. So over to you.
Well, thank you for the warm welcome there, Daniel. I'm Patrick Murdoch. I am Chief Platform Architect at an organization called Behavior. We specialize in digital therapeutics. I do recognize a lot of names on the call here. So those of you that knew me in a prior life, I spent 23 years at Humana up until a couple of months ago as Chief Interoperability Architect and Fellow. I'm the co-chief architect of the Fire at Scale Task Force, which is what we're going to be walking through today. I'm also very active in HL7 in general, and DaVinci and several of the other accelerators as well. And my partner on the call today that will be helping me present is Alex Contour from ONC. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Happy to be here. Appreciate the invite. I'm Alex Contour. I'm with the Office of National Coordinator in our Office of Technology Standards Division. I work a lot on FAST. That's what we'll be talking about, but I also help to manage ONC's portfolio of projects with HL7. I've done work on TEPCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. I've worked on some of our state HIE cooperative agreement programs in the past, and also done some work on FAST fire provider directories.
That's great. Thank you. Rich, I think this might be your first call. Rich Boland.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, it is. So thanks to Amanda, who made sure I got on the list to join these things. So Rich Boland, I am with Cordata Healthcare Innovations out of Cincinnati, Ohio. So my whole background's always has been child welfare for 30 years, proud to say, and now working closely with some innovative technologies where the cross section is healthcare and child welfare. So thanks for having me. Glad to be part of it.
Glad you're here, Rich. Thanks for joining.
Great.
John Manning, I think you may be new to the call.
Yeah, somewhat new. I'll turn my camera on in about 5 minutes when I finish my commute going home. Dave Walsh invited me. John Manning, emergency physician, informatician, CEO of Mayjune, which is a development company that makes cross-platform digital apps in Fire, and a Google developer expert in Dart and Flutter. We built Firefly, which is almost 400,000 lines of code that connects the cross-platform toolkit Flutter to all versions of Fire that are currently available.
That's great. Thank you. So a little bit too much sun, because now I remember that you did actually present to us. So apologies here. I'll blame it on the sun or the heat or something.
Hey, Daniel,
sure.
Can I take 30 seconds here? Because I just noticed that Ivy is back with us, and I just wanted to give her a very, very warm hello. And it's nice to see you.
Thanks. It's nice to be back with you all. And thanks, Daniel, for adding me to this call. I'm looking forward to learning more about this project team.
Okay, I was just going to call on you to say hello and welcome. So Ivy comes from a long, distinguished history from New York State and New York City, doing real leading work on data interoperability in the city for a bunch of years. So I'm glad that you're back with us here. Welcome to the call. Thanks a lot. And again, I think I'm going to mispronounce your name. I apologize, but welcome as well.
So you could just pretend the G is silent. My name is Nan McDonald, and I have a couple roles. I work for HealthLX, which is an interoperability software company. I also have a role at the Institute for Augmented Intelligence in Medicine. The director is Abel Coe, who some of you might know because Abel was part of FAST a while back. I've had 15 years in healthcare, mostly in the data management space.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think maybe Sarah, I'm gonna test my memory here.
Yeah, hi.
Hey.
My
I'm
name
on
is
a call for the next hour. Can I call you back or is there something urgent?
Yes, that's Dr. McCoy. I'm going to put you
Hello.
on mute for a second.
Hello.
Sorry.
So, hi, my name is
You
Sarah
gotta-
Zaporta, and I am the DevOps / cloud person for May, June. I work with Dr. John Manning, and I love it. And before that, I was at a tech company called Datadog. And prior to that, I was at another
Hang
small
on a second.
company.
I'm sorry. We just have a little bit of there. Thank you for.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's not your fault. We just had a little bit of muting action going on there, but continue. Thank you.
Yeah, so I came from Datadog before I ended up at May, June. And before that, I was a small tech company called Datto. And prior to that, I was in a pharma company called Boehringer Ingelheim for 10 years before I switched over to cloud technology. It's a long story, so I'll spare you all the gory details. But yeah, so I love being here, and I'm glad to be here at this meeting.
That's great.
Nice to meet you
Thank
all.
Thank you very much for joining us. I think having a little bit of pharma experience here, I'm sure others have it as well, but it's great to bring that into the conversation as well. Anybody else new that I haven't introduced yet or haven't introduced yourselves yet? I think we're good. Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to ask Matt just to say a few words. I thought we spent just about 5 minutes on HIMSS, just for folks who didn't have the pleasure of joining the other 20,000 people in Orlando and putting on 20,000 steps a day, which is the only one of the better parts of the conference there. So Matt, do you have a few thoughts you
Sure.
want to contribute to us? Great, take it away.
Yeah, I'll also talk about HITAC, which is this committee that is reporting to Congress on the 21st Century Cures Act and progress towards those goals. So if you've ever, for HIMSS, if you've ever kind of experienced fear of missing out, you know, HIMSS is kind of the penultimate example of always experiencing fear of missing out, where there are a million sessions going on at the same time that you want to be at each of them. For me, more importantly than anything, any of the sessions where it was just connecting with people who I have worked on various standards bodies, whether it be in Gravity Project or Direct Trust, and, you know, meeting Evelyn Gallego in person. You know, so that was probably the most valuable, and also, you know, exhibiting. I'll just say a few words about the some of the committee. There was an event on social determinants of health, which, you know, had people like the Gravity Project and a number of other people, where they underlined the lack of behavioral health data being included in meaningful use. So there's really a lack of infrastructure. They talked about the challenges of like person matching and eligibility. There was a very interesting session on AI governance, standards and governance, with like Monashir, and so there's some really interesting insights on that. And then Michael Phelps did the keynote, where he talked about addressing the mental health crisis. He has a foundation that does that focuses on socio-emotional learning, which I think is a very interesting potential opportunities for collaboration with Inc. Around teaching kids how to communicate their emotions, and really the importance of authentic communication, and you know, when dealing with mental health, your own mental health issues, which he has experienced, like depression. So this HITAC report to Congress had a few different areas it covered. It covered like changes in healthcare technology for public health, interoperability, privacy and security, and patient access to information. And so it includes identifications of the gaps in some of these areas and recommendations on where to go. It's really a who's who of the evolution of HL7 and fire standards, TEFCA, over the last year, so I recommend you check it out. It talked a lot about, so there was recommendations on patient matching around aligning around USCDI to improve patient matching. It recommended increasing health equity across populations by making health IT more accessible. And there's this tension essentially between the goal of making patient data accessible as is charged so that they can access their data in an app of their choice, with also the privacy and security kind of ideas or like challenges associated with that. How do you do that in a way? Sorry, how do you do that in a way that you know, make sure that, you know, people's data is not being compromised or is at risk? Unfortunately, they did talk about privacy and security, but mostly they just made recommendations of researching it, doing a literature review on whether, you know, what consumer concerns are on this issue. And then they also talked about the risks of AI bias. So yeah, I thought it was a very interesting report, and that's what I have.
Were there any action steps coming out of that, or is it really more of a
Yes.
report, or, you know?
There's a host of action steps,
Mhm.
A whole host of list of clear actions in each of these areas. But my concern was that many of the action steps were, you know, we need to research this more. Or we need to have like a listening community or whatever it might be. Without, there are certain areas where you know, as consumers, we'd love to see faster action, especially around privacy and consent. They didn't have any clear, charge of saying we need a consent utility, for example, or anything along those lines. It was more just research. So that's what I got.
Yeah, I think we just need to let people know that there's been some work that's going on, which is kind of part of the role here overall. Any other quick comments from him? I have a couple of thoughts, but I just want to leave the floor open for other observations people had or insights.
Yeah, I'd add real quick. I thought Matt gave a great summary. There was also I'll give a plug for the Global Health Equity Symposium, which was a separate symposium on Monday. I was on a panel session and we were talking about multi-stakeholder collaborative, blah, 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 or something, but it was really about community-oriented care sessions. I found it very exciting. I've had some separate discussions about it and looked to get into it. And the analogy given with one of my fellow panelists, who I'm going to be working a bit more, Silas Buchanan, who's doing community health efforts, is I see my pastor or my parishioners 27 hours a month. I see my doctor for 20 minutes. So who do I have a better trust network with? Right. And with that in mind, how can those, especially religious community, but any community-oriented activity where communities build centers of trust, and you have healthcare professionals in there who can work within that community, do things to build community networks of information and improve equity because of those communities versus the traditional health system hub and spoke delivery model that we have right now. And then 30 more seconds, the week before HIMSS was Vive. I was at Vive too. And Pooja, who I know joins this group, gave a real nice presentation on BPM Plus Health, e-consent. And then Pooja moderated a panel with myself, Paul from Commonwealth, and Shane McNamee from Smile CDR. And I talked about Project Unify and consent, and each of us offered different perspectives on consent. And of course, Shane talked about it from the FHIR perspective and BPM Plus Health as well.
That's great. Thanks. A couple of observations I made. I spent a little bit of time in the interoperability showcase, looking at some of the various different programs there. Matt, I stopped by, but I didn't see you a couple of times, but must have been elsewhere. But I did have a chance to go to the consent and the advanced directive work that our colleagues at IOI have done, and really thoroughly impressed with the data flow and the description of the business process approach, and then the ability to actually share that information in real time. So I had asked Mary to do a quick overview of it here. She wasn't able to join today, but I think if that was recorded, I presume that was recorded at some point. I'm not quite sure. It was pretty impressive, and I think there's a lot to build on from that. And I think that there's I'm looking forward to doing that and moving our consent work forward with them. And a couple other quick things. One is sometimes we see things happen in events. So I know at ONC meeting a couple of years ago, social determinants was all a buzz right before COVID hit. And certainly SDOH was all over HIMSS this year. It was the revelation. Every healthcare provider had some description, something they were doing on SDOH, which was good, a bit entertaining as well, to see that buzzword sort of really permeate HIMSS in a pretty profound way. So I think it's on top of mind for folks, and hopefully it's at least the first layer of the onion, peeling that back a little bit and seeing where those things can and really sort of connect. I think Mickey Tripathi and Dan Jurgen sort of addressed that in their keynote on the CDC and ONC working together on data modernization, and are from all accounts really working towards that. I did take something, I did write down in my notebook here that Mickey did say that by 2023, all data must be machine readable, mandated. So that would also then include unstructured data, which we know from a social determinant perspective is a critical component. So there was a lot of activity there that was really pretty interesting. And one of the pieces on the SDOH piece I wanted to just mention was there was a lot of discussion around risk stratification, really trying to understand clients and customers who were most at risk. And I saw that in presentation after presentation after presentation. And I think that's a great starting point, really understand who's in the population and really looking at the social factors to think about risk stratification. And I know our partners within the Integrated Care for Kids are working hard to try to identify that. But I thought it was really super interesting and different approaches to doing that and trying to quantify that. And then one thing that kind of was interesting that I just observed was Nuance Software, formerly, what was it called? Formerly?
Well, Nuance is now Microsoft, or part of
Yes, Microsoft just bought Nuance. So voice to text is coming. And I had the opportunity to go play in their booth a little bit and was duly impressed with the ability for it really to go from voice to text in a pretty seamless way. 99.9% correct. Just goofed up on one word, but that was kind of fun to see that there as well.
And Daniel, let me give a plug since you mentioned voice. We had a half-day summit on voice and AI and healthcare, natural language processing, and the like at Vive, and I thought it was great. It was a formulary or formulative sort of summit effort, but I found it really informative to talk about the trends globally and in other industries around natural language processing, and what it means to make NLP available through Alexa and other devices in healthcare at home.
Interesting, yeah. I don't know if HIMSS does a kind of a summary of sorts or what they actually post. Does anyone know that? Do they post that? Because they had a bunch of sessions they did virtually, but I don't know what they actually do for actually post-event publication.
Your HIMSS registration gets you access to the virtual library.
Okay. All right. So that would be great. There were so many things as well to try to take in. It is a bit overwhelming.
I think also in the past they have like this little like letter or a newspaper that they would produce every day, and which is pretty interesting. They had a summary of different sessions. I always thought that would be really cool for people who didn't attend to kind of see what was there.
Oh, that's a great point. And I remember coming out of the hotel, I saw one that was sponsored by one of the vendors, but I didn't see the typical HIMSS publication that you're referring to. You're exactly. I don't know if for this year they cut it back or if they're just moving away from that or whatever. So
I always thought that was great for all the sessions I couldn't get to.
Yeah, no, they handed it as we're getting on the bus, they handed it out to folks, how they actually sort of write it, produce it, and then get it ready to go the next day as a miracle of digital print, I guess, or digital publication there. So
If anybody knows anybody on the organizing committee of HIMSS, that would be a great thing to like make available online for people who didn't go to HIMSS.
That's a great question. We have there's a SDOH, there's a HIMSS SDOH group that started that usually some of us participate in. And then actually some of the folks who were actually there from HIMSS, we had a chance to connect in with. So that's probably a good follow-up, Amanda, to follow up, see if they actually do anything like that, because that would be great to see, again, so we don't end up recreating the wheel from stuff that has actually been presented and done. There's so much stuff going on there. So thanks for that. In just a few minutes, Brian, are you here with us? I got a lot of folks in the picture here. We want to do a couple of work group quick updates before we move on to the main tent, as it were.
I will indeed. I'll make it very, very brief. These work group updates really are because we're doing the work of those work groups within the National Science Foundation Open Knowledge Network workshop work. And last week we had another check-in workshop with them for the electronic consent services use case that we're progressing within that organization. We've got 26 different folks that have sort of put their shoulder to the wheel in helping to define what consent services needs to be. There are no surprises, by the way, just some reassurance. But it's good to know that there are even more folks out there going, we really need this. We need this even in open knowledge networks that may be largely populated by public information, because all information is public, but some is more public than others. Let's just misquote Animal Farm there. So there's a lot of enthusiasm from government agencies in particular, and from the healthcare community in general, especially the healthcare research community, in having some kind of a common consent service available to help control who gets to see what. And the decarceration and reunification use case currently has 12 people on it, which is delightful to see that it's grown that large. And that group, I think we have the prospect in the next 4 weeks of doubling that group, given the subject matter experts we've identified that we need and are working on tapping to bring into the project. So that's doing great. And I don't see Paul on here, but I know that the NEEM ontology use case has, I think, about 20 people who are supporting it and working on refining this. And just for those of you who weren't here at the last meeting, the goal of these workshops over the course of the next 3 months is to further refine and improve proposals so that NSF can then identify what are the most important things to invest in as they go through their summertime budgeting process for next fiscal year starting in September. That's it for me.
Brian, do we have any other work group updates?
No, that pretty much covers ontologies, which of course we're working on ontologies as part of this open knowledge network, consent technology, and user story. We're kind of doing all of those in 3 big pushes here within this NSF workshop. And all of our internal folks are participating, or most of our internal folks are participating, as well as some new enthusiasts that we've managed to lure in, some of whom may end up starting to come to Unify meetings.
All right. That sounds great. Thank you for that. I know it's been a big commitment, and it's a bit of a marathon until you get to the starting line. So hopefully the work will pay off for all of us in terms of actually focusing on those things that are really most important here. So
as long as I can structure it as unified projects instead of yet another standards body that I have to
yes, we'll cut down on the standards body meetings, or at least distribute them about a bit more there. So that'll be useful. Unless there are any other
one more announcement, if you
go ahead.
I should also point out that the Information Exchange for Human Services Working Group, or ICSFIS, as we all hate to call it, we had another meeting. It was today, wasn't it, Courtney?
It was today.
I've had a long day. We're spinning out two subgroups, one to focus on resource discovery, aka human services directory information standards, and one to focus on information exchange for individual, family, household social care, aka referrals and other information exchange technologies. Those meetings, those subgroups are going to spin out the first full week of April, so a couple of weeks from now. And after that, I'm hoping we can talk specifically about what those groups are proposing to do. So something to look forward to in a few weeks.
Rita's got a question, Brian. Is open referral part of the resources directory conversation?
That particular subgroup is being led by Greg Bloom.
Should we invite Greg to come talk?
Greg has been here once or twice before. I'm more than happy to invite him back, especially now that I know he has some other fun and exciting things to talk about. And as usual, I need to emphasize that ICSFIS is not duplicating any effort being done elsewhere or competing with any other standards efforts. In fact, because so many of us are working in so many of these different groups, we're being very careful to sort of carve out the things that aren't being done in any of our other working groups. For instance, we know that in the HL7 Human and Social Services Working Group, we got a presentation about mapping from HSDS, which is part of Open Referral, to FHIR by Greg, by the way. And we made it clear that we're not interested in doing that mapping. We're happy that somebody is doing that. But because Open Referral is a de facto standard, not a de jure standard, we're happy to progress HSDS as a de jure standard, ANSI standard under the auspices of ICSFIS, so that, there's another little brick in the wall, basically, another little piece of the foundation stuff that needs to be done in order for us to have a broad-ranging set of standards, not just from within Direct Trust and ICSFIS, but also within HL7 and the Gravity Project and IHE, et cetera.
Fantastic. So unless there are any other last moment updates, people want to.
I got one last moment update for 30 seconds. I realize this is a topic that we don't normally address, but I thought it's good for this group.
Thanks,
BPM Plus Health put together an interoperability demo for human trafficking, which I was told by reliable sources faced a lot of opposition or just inertia from HIMSS to get it in, but they did get it in. And last week, the White House announced their new initiative on human trafficking, and White House representatives actually showed up at HIMSS to see the BPM Plus Health interoperability demonstration.
Awesome. That is awesome. That's great. Unfortunately, its importance of it is probably not diminishing. So with that, Patrick, let me turn it over to you. I think I've made both you and Melissa. Yep, there you go. Great. I might say thank you again, because I know you introduced FAST to us. Gosh, I'm trying to remember, it was maybe almost 2 years ago.
It was,
so.
yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So we're still here, as they say.
Great, and we're glad to be back. And I think I'm actually going to turn over to Alex Kunter. He's going to kick us off, and then I'll talk through some of the details. Alex?
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks. And thanks again for having us. Once again, my name is Alex Contour. I'm with ONC, joined here by Patrick, who's FAST Chief Architect. Really happy to be here. I'm enjoying the freewheeling conversation in both the chat and the loud. So it seems like a very welcoming group. I'm glad to be here. Go to the next slide. So really just very quickly, we include this slide in all of our presentations, just acknowledging the fact that we do operate under an antitrust notice, that we're not here to, share intellectual property or other, protected secret information, that sort of thing. We're really focused on developing standards and taking a community approach in that. So we just like to include this up front. So today, Patrick's going to be giving, Patrick's actually going to be doing most of the heavy lifting. Thank you, Patrick. And he'll be talking a little bit more about FAST, the work that we've been doing, some of the work that we've got going on underway, a number of different implementation guides. And then we'll spend some time talking about the fire accelerator that we're currently in the process of standing up. It's a super exciting time in FAST. As we transition away from what was previously an ONC convened initiative to something that is more wholly owned by the community, the HL7 standards development community. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how to get involved in FAST if you haven't already. I'm glad to see a handful of folks on the line today that I know are active participants in some of our Tiger Team meetings. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Patrick.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate the overview there. And Daniel and team, thanks again for having us back. I was thinking earlier about, as I was reviewing my notes, it has been about 2 years since we came and gave our first overview of FAST a while back. A quick HIMSS note, because I was there last week, and yes, I'm still suffering a little bit from HIMSS lag as well, is that it was great to see folks. I thought the sessions were really good, but one of the things that was really small that I found very beneficial, and maybe for folks that are going out to look for presentations that may have been recorded virtually and you couldn't see it because you were in another one, is the search capability on the site to find things that were really related to a subject matter or content was much better, I thought, than in previous years, as far as looking for specific content. So I don't know if they went to a full text search or what, but I thought it was very, very beneficial. And the other thing that I'll note is one of the reasons I'm really excited to be with the group here today is, as I mentioned kind of a few minutes ago, I recently went from a 70,000 employee organization, payer, to a less than a 70 people organization focused on behavioral health and digital therapeutics. So I will say that my lens has maybe shifted a little bit as I look at interoperability more holistically. I think we did certainly before, but looking at it more from a potentially health equity or underserved areas of space that certainly need or certainly can benefit from running scale or running fire at scale. And as we kick off the presentation here, this is what we call our crayon slide. I'm not sure we had this last time we were here, but it's one of our favorites. It may be a little too crayonic for the level of folks that we have on the call here today from a understanding of interoperability. But what we try to illustrate here is that the problem that we're trying to solve from a FAST perspective can be categorized really into infrastructure barrier or things that are perceived barriers to running fire at scale. So if we go look on the left side, we've got a very simple diagram. We've got a clinic on the left, and we look maybe a health plan on the right, and we've got these vehicles. And think of the vehicles as use cases. Whether it be a Da Vinci use case or anything, SDOH, gravity, whatever the need may be to exchange information between two actors in healthcare. And these vehicles actually are able to make it from the left side to the right side and back. The problem is it doesn't scale because for each one of those use cases, we basically constructed a customized roadway, right? Which works at very small scale, but doesn't work at large scale. So what we're trying to do from a FAST perspective is aligned with the picture on the right side, in which you have the same use cases, the same motor scooter, the car, the school bus, and the red truck. You got the same clinic on the left side and the same health plan on the right side. But now we've got use cases that are following guidelines or rules of the road, using shared initiatives or shared agreements. We got lines in the middle of the road. We got a stop sign. We got a this way model or this way sign that shows the use cases how to go different places. And so it's a very orderly arrangement. And one of the beautiful things about this model is that we can add additional use cases onto the existing roadway without building a new road from the ground up. Sorry, I'm looking at the message here. I've got OCD, so I'm going to have to ignore the chat. Melissa and Alex, if you guys see something that I need to look at, feel free to stop me. Otherwise, we'll never get through the presentation. I apologize. Cool. So anyway, that's our crayon picture. There are precedents from other spaces like X12 and the NCPDP standards and those types of things. They're not direct analogs because we're using RESTful APIs, and they operate a little bit differently than the classic world of the future of the previous generations of interop. So I'm going to draw a few distinctions as we go through this here. Okay, Melissa, if we could go ahead and go to the next slide. Let's do a little bit of a history lesson. And Alex mentioned this just a little bit. And when I was refreshing on the slide, I actually thought I was going to have to reach out to Melissa to make sure she had the right dates on here, going back to 2017. But I think that actually is correct, and that we've been doing this for more than 5 years. And let me first define, what the Fire and Scale Task Force, or FAST, is. And it's basically a group of representatives across healthcare in general that have come together to try to help eliminate barriers to bringing contemporary, RESTful fire interop to scale, right? And that's our focus. It's not on any specific use case, any specific actor. It's basically trying to come up with existing standards and document those well, best practices, or in some cases, creating some additional documentation and maybe coming up with a couple of new approaches that help us run our use cases at scale. As Alex noted on the antitrust thing, a lot of the folks in the space could historically have been considered competitors. So as we're having these meetings and we've got a tiger team model, we make sure that we're addressing things as members of the community and solving for the common goodwill as opposed to any one specific actor or sector of healthcare. And that's benefited us quite well over the years. But going back all the way to 2017, I still remember the first meeting. We're at the ONC building up in DC. And there were several of us in the room talking about, hey, we've got fire. It's going to become one of the preliminary ways to share information. We've got to start dealing with these infrastructure issues now, as the other communities are starting to develop functional use cases so that we don't run into barriers. So we were initially called a very, very creative name. I kind of, have a shiver up my spine when I look at it now, but the Payer and Provider Fire Task Force, right? P2 is what we used to call ourselves. We quickly recognized that we weren't good, creative enough to come up with good titles. So we rebranded, in early 2018 and called it the Fire at Scale Task Force. Because quite transparently, literally after the first meeting, when we came up with this P2 name, we recognized that it was way too narrow because it didn't address all the other actors that needed to share information. So we quickly rebranded. I came up with a really cool logo that one of Alex's compatriots put together. The structure of tiger teams with SMEs coming together to solve these ecosystem issues. For example, we started with an ecosystem use case team that identified the barriers. And then we assembled a group, for example, for identity, for exchange across intermediaries, for security, for piloting, for versioning, national directory, brought those teams together. Those teams worked from 2018 up through current, but through the end of 2021 in the FAST construct, right? Which was closely aligned with HL7, but was not officially an HL7 accelerator like Gravity or DaVinci or Codex or whatever the case may be. We're in the process of moving into an actual HL7 fast accelerator. That work is currently underway, and Alex is going to walk through some of that towards the end of the presentation here. But the key thing on this slide is, as we moved from a task force that was operating at a tiger team level, we had good governance and good process. It was almost completely volunteer based. We did have some funding that was provided for example, preparation of materials, artifacts, as it relates to PowerPoint presentations, some of the implementation guides that we moved through HL7, some project management and those types of things, but 95% of it was completely volunteer. We quickly, or not quickly, over the last couple of years, recognized to make these artifacts and these models persistent and durable over time, that we needed to more closely align with the HL7 model. So going back two years ago, we started moving our documentation into project scope statements, into draft implementation guides, going through the connectathon processes. We've got several of those in STU at this point. So we're going to walk through some of those in a second. And that's kind of where we are. We're in the process of moving into the HL7 Fast Accelerator. None of the work that we started before that time has stopped. It's just moving into a more formal process. All right, Melissa, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide, we're going to jump right into, we talked about what FAST is from a high level. We've talked about the process of moving into HL7. To quickly jump into a fire transaction journey will help illustrate what we're trying to do from a FAST perspective. And we're going to repeat the same information several times on several different slides over the next couple here, right? So you're going to get it from this graphic. We get another graphic. We're going to talk about it from a verbal perspective. But this slide, although it's a little bit of an eye chart, is actually quite beneficial as it relates to understanding the patterns that we have recognized and we see from a FAST perspective. So in this particular example, I think we've got a PCP, on the left side over there, primary care physician is needing to get information from a payer. That's just an example use case. You can select any use case that you like, and I would bet that the infrastructure capabilities needed to run that use case at scale are probably very close to what we have here, right? And we vetted this across, different HL7 accelerators or just use cases that weren't even part of HL7 accelerators, created a matrix and ran some of these through there. And these patterns or these needs, these barriers, these core capabilities that were needed continue to be reinforced, right? So I'm going to quickly walk through this and call these out. Again, we're going to go through a couple of other slides as well. But basically, in this case, we've got a PCP that's he or she is in their EHR. They need information from a payer, right? Maybe it's for prior authorization or quality reporting or whatever the case may be. The first step in the requesting system there, which is an EHR, is how do they communicate with the payer, right? In today's world, that requires prior knowledge of the endpoints available from that payer, which may have been gathered through phone calls, through legal negotiations, whatever the case may be. What we're trying to get through from a FAST perspective, considering the dynamic nature of how this ecosystem is evolving, those need to be able to be looked up in real time via an API. So if the provider needs to speak with a PCP, PCP to a payer via FHIR, the ability to discover those endpoints via a directory is going to be key, right? As we keep going, we're going through steps 2 and 3. If this transaction perhaps is going through a clearinghouse or some other intermediary that the actor on the right side is using, the ability for the infrastructure to support that without providing or requiring additional burden on either side is going to be key. Identity matching, so that we know that patient A on the left side is the same as member B in this case. On the right side is going to be critical as well. The ability to make sure that we're using the same security model, because if we're using some type of a OAuth system on the left side and we're expecting headers or tokens on the right side, that's not necessarily going to work. So that making sure that we're using best practices from a security perspective. Also, if we need to go between versions of FHIR, 4 to 5 or 5 to 6, whatever that's going to be in the future, that's going to be key. And other things that are basically conformance and certification, the ability to have piloted this as well. So going from left to right, you see a series of things that need to happen. And as the return transaction goes right to left, we see that all happening again, right? If that's asynchronous, then the same series of steps, the same capabilities are needed to ensure those transactions can move left to right, right to left, up, down, backward, forwards, whatever your favorite directional alignment is, right? And again, if we could go ahead and go to the next slide, here's a slightly different version of some of those core capabilities, right? This is our 50,000 foot conceptual architecture diagram. And again, it represents a lot of what was on the previous slide, just in a slightly different format, a little bit cleaner. So the capabilities that we're referring to as it relates to the FHIR at scale are basically identified on here, right? We've got, first of all, security, authentication, and authorization. Not only determining that the person or that we have the appropriate security via UDAP, but also an assertion of the right to access and use data. So using JOT tokens and those types of things. So agreeing on a security and authentication authorization infrastructure is going to be key. That's one of the primary underpinnings. In this particular case, we've got an actor on the left side and an actor on the right side that appear to be going through intermediaries. I mean, it could be a clearinghouse, could be an HIE, whatever the case may be. But the ability to route those transactions between left to right or right to left without the actors on either side having to do additional configuration or do something different because it's going through an intermediary. Basically using existing internet protocols and existing DNS and other types of things that are the Internet of Things to ensure the routability of those transactions is going to be very important. Talked about identity just a second ago. Patient on the left side needs to be the same as the patient on the right side, or the member on the right side, or the pop health person on the right side, whatever your favorite actor in healthcare is. We've got to make sure that we are identifying the right people. The endpoint directory, again, is the same, meaning that the ability to dynamically discover other endpoints, because as this contemporary interoperability model continues to evolve, the older model that most of us use today, in which we've got local configuration files or whatever that we've, are manually typing in or discovering via GitHub repositories or whatever, are not going to scale, because as people onboard to the ecosystem, as they stand up additional versions of FHIR, additional capabilities or whatever, the ability to dynamically discover that via a trusted model is going to be key. And of course, the conformance and certification process, ensuring that as folks are onboarded into the ecosystem, there is a trust level that they meet a certain requirement for performance and the ability to interact in this environment. And then also pilots. We are actually partnering, or going to be partnering, with the new implementation division at HL7, which is starting to roll out, so that we are not piloting this as only part of a FAST initiative. In reality, these capabilities truly only show their value if they're partnered with a functional use case, right? Because these are infrastructure capabilities, they're not functional use cases. All right, Melissa, if we could go ahead and go to the next slide. And I'm going to walk through some of these. I know we have limited time today, and quite transparently, we could probably spend 2 hours each on each one of those, each one of these different solutions. I know that most people probably don't have the tolerance for that on a Wednesday afternoon. So I'm going to go through these fairly quickly and talk through some of these in a little more detail, and then talk about the status of each one of these initiatives as it moves through the HL7 process. From a security perspective, what are we trying to get to? What was the barrier that it was identified? The primary issues that we were trying to work out was, first of all, that it was not dynamic, right? There had to have been pre-knowledge of two actors. Either they shared certificates or they've done other handshakes to allow the communication to go bi-directionally, right? There wasn't a model that existed to allow actor A, if having the appropriate consent, was able to discover an endpoint and then dynamically access or assert to the actor B that they, through a trusted provider, or a trusted source, and have access or should be able to access that information. That's the first thing. The second part of it is there's a lot of solutions out there for security, right? We've got many different solutions that are active in healthcare. And if we're not using a uniform model for this, scalability simply doesn't work. Right, so those are the two primary things that we were trying to get to. The cool thing about this is we did not invent anything to bring the security solution to bear, right? We did extend a few things as part of the UDAP process as it relates to authorization of use and those types of things. But the underlying UDAP protocol, Unified Data Access Profiles, is intact. It provides the foundation for what we're doing here. The good thing about this solution is that it's been out, being tested for 5 years. I think some of the documentation was initially published in 2017. At the same time we were standing this up, but it was actually being tested in Connectathons before that. It's in use, Care Quality and Commonwealth to some extent as it relates to this model. The implementation guide was published back in 2021, I should say balloted back in 2021, is going through ballot reconciliation at this point. So it's fairly well along the path. It's going to be active in the Connectathons that we have coming up here in May, but that one is well through the HL7 process at this point. If we go ahead and go to the next slide, Melissa, again, you could spend weeks on this particular slide, but understanding that the foundation of what the FAST security solution brings to bear is, again, the Unified Data Access Protocols is the foundational components. Some of the key features of that is job-based client authorization. So we're using JSON Web Tokens, which are very common in today's world, to basically do the authentication model. UDAP server metadata, again, it's closely related to some of the endpoint directory stuff we're going to talk about, to ensure that as people are dynamically connecting with each other, that we don't have rogue players, and there's a trusted party ensuring that if a request comes through this model, they can be trusted, right? Their certificate is available in a trusted location, and it's okay to share information. The dynamic client registration, this is another key thing. It was very critical, or was manifested itself in, the client access API that many of us were dealing with over the last couple of years. In that case, the fact that with, member consent and similar consent models, there is no tolerance for spending 6 months or 12 months with nothing against lawyers. Some of my best friends are lawyers, but sitting in a room negotiating things or different, security or legal agreements, if consent is given and it's running under an appropriate model, we've got to be able to share the information. Authorization assertions, basically saying, hey, this is the reason I need access to Alex Contour's information for health plan operations, for treatment purposes, whatever the case may be. The UDAP certifications and tiered OAuth. So as we're going across multiple actors and roles, that the ability to understand what role we're at, what level we're at for data access is key. All right, Melissa, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide. The hybrid and intermediary exchange solution. This is one of my personal favorites, I will say. But before we jump into it, I want to quickly define what we're talking about from an intermediary, because although from an overall solution perspective, this is one of the, I don't want to say it's the simplest, but it is able to reuse a lot of what we do from a day-to-day basis, from an internet, from a DNS perspective, from, C records and stuff like that we use in the internet and DNS today. But one of the things that we would consistently get hung up on is what is an intermediary, right? And that's a very broad term. What we're talking about from an intermediary here is an organization, not necessarily a software package, that an organization that is part of their business or operational model facilitates the exchange of information between actors. These could be clearinghouses, they could be HIEs, there's a lot more intermediaries out there as well, but that's what we're talking about. Not one specific package, but an organization that facilitates the exchange of information as part of their operational model. So what we're trying to get to from a barrier perspective. Well, the first is that we all recognize, and this is one of the distinctions that I hinted at on the first crayon picture slide, and I'm going to drive home a little bit here, is that the model that comes with contemporary RESTful APIs is different than historically how we have done integration in the past, at least at some level, because the point-to-point model in which you have a service that is activated from actor A on actor B, and you start sharing information. That's the baseline of the technical infrastructure that drives contemporary RESTful FHIR interactions, right? But we also recognize that we have intermediaries in healthcare. We're not inventing new ones here. We're recognizing that they exist and that they will continue to play an important part in the healthcare ecosystem. And we need to account for that, because if we come up with a model in which things behave differently, if an intermediary is in play, we have inherently put a constraint or a barrier on the exchange of information. If you have to go, I'm going through an intermediary, I got to do it this way. If I'm going point to point, we got to do it this way. That's not what we're looking for, right? We want to make sure that we're not putting burden on actors to deal with intermediaries. What the solution basically is using a standard internet information or standard internet protocols, basically defining DNS entries, using the endpoint directory to say that if you want to talk to me, here's my outward facing interface. If you're point to point, that means it's your FHIR server or your thing. If it's not, it could be an intermediary, right? So very foundational things that have been running the internet for many years are being brought to bear to support this model. The hybrid exchange model, again, just to kind of repeat what I said just a second ago to make sure it sinks in, is that supporting both point-to-point, which in this diagram is the provider, the top line there, or the top section of the document, which you've got a provider EMR, EHR on the left side, kind of orangish. You've got a payer on the purple, and they're doing direct point-to-point communication. That EHR is also connecting to the green payer on the right side, and the purple payer is connecting to the pop health company on the left side. Those are point-to-point communications. But we also recognize that in that red box that we have there in the middle, you've got an intermediary. In this case, it looks like it's a clearinghouse, which is facilitating the exchange between the payer on the lower right corner and the provider on the lower left corner as well. But in this model, all these actors are able to connect to each other, and the intermediary is brokering those communications for those actors that prefer to use intermediary capabilities to serve their need. A couple of those could be, just as a refresher here, for example, some organizations don't want to stand up an interoperability team, right? Maybe they don't have the infrastructure. Maybe the fact that the intermediary provides cloud scalability or enhanced security, such as phishing attacks or denial of service, or some other onboarding operational capability that is their specialty, right? So there are business and operational and technical features that intermediaries bring to bear that basically provide or ensure their their continued use in this hybrid model. From an overall balloting perspective or overall HL7 perspective, this went through its initial ballot in January of this year and was approved there. So it's currently going through ballot reconciliation. And we'll be going through, I think the next Connect-a-thon, we've had 5 so far. We're not going to be doing one in May, but we'll pick that back up in August or September, whenever the next Connect-a-thon is after that. But as of right now, the goal to publish the STU1 and Q1 of 2022, that's our goal after we get the ballot reconciliation done. All righty, if we could go to the next one, just pop over to the next one. Melissa, I'm going to pick up a little speed so we can save some time for questions at the end. The National Healthcare Directory, and some of my peers would be upset if I renamed it on the fly, but I think it's helpful to say that it's really, at least for the MPP, a National Healthcare Endpoint Directory. Not that it doesn't have other attributes of actors in healthcare, but the primary goal, at least initially, is to make those endpoints available so that they can dynamically be discovered, right? Because in today's world, in the space that most of us live in, we have local configuration of how to connect to others in healthcare. A lot of times, right? We know that if we want to go to, this particular fire server, here's the address. Here's how you get to it, right? That doesn't scale, right? Because as new actors come in, actors change, actors go out, whatever. I think we did the math at some point. I don't remember the number of permutations of the different actors, but it was a ginormous number. So what we're trying to get to here is a national source for validated endpoints that all trusted sources can query to be able to access that information. And that's the 3 implementation guides that we're currently working on. I'm hoping to ballot those this year as well, the 2022 ballot cycle. There are 3 implementation guides: the National Directory and the access one. I think maybe it's on the next slide, Melissa, if you want to go ahead and go forward. And I'm actually, maybe it makes sense. Melissa's going to be really upset with me, but I'm going to dynamically renumber these just because it makes sense for me to talk about this starting in the left corner where it says 3. Let's start there. We're going to go in reverse order because the place to start is making sure that we have validated information in the endpoint directory. So that implementation guide provides a mechanism or a model for folks basically attesting to a directory that, I am Dr. Patrick, here's my fire endpoint, and I electronically sign this to say, if you want to connect with me, this is my validated endpoint, right? And so I'm asserting to the directory there that is actually mine. The second part of it is the model in really number 2, or query number 2 is how do I query that, right? Because once folks have asserted to the endpoint directory, hey, this is how you contact me, the second implementation guide is, well, how do I access it, right? How do I actually query the directory to get the information back? We have tested this in Connect-a-thons using search fields such as the name, the different identifiers that may be associated with an NPI, or whatever the case may be. And then, being able to query that and dynamically connect to other actors as well. And then I think the third one there that I kind of skipped over is we already talked about the attestation. The other thing that I want to call out is that, and people tend to get really hung up on this, is when we talk about, a ginormous, national endpoint, right? Or national directory. Sometimes it makes sense to think about this, and I'm not necessarily advocating that, but we have versions of this now for the most part. We've got with the Direct project, there are directories there. With NPES, there are some provider directories there. This one is a little bit more holistic in that it is modeled to be able to store provider information, top health, intermediaries, payers, other actors in healthcare. And it doesn't mean that you have to always go to a central source to get it. It can be federated as well, so that if there are local or regional copies in which you can access the information, you can even cache it locally if you want to for a period of time, because it's not going to change that frequently. That's certainly part of the model as well. All right, Melissa, if we could go ahead and go forward, I'll quickly go through the identity management. This one is always an interesting topic because it impacts all of us so much. And again, the model that we're going through here is not to solve world hunger out of the gate, but recommend or document a solution which gets us to the next step of basically having a model that is consistent across the actors. It allows us to, in a trusted, high fidelity model, be able to identify folks across different actors, right? And I'm going to think of it. Let's go ahead and just go to the next slide, because the words are difficult to comprehend, but looking at this very basic picture is a little bit more helpful. And so those of you that are very familiar with the FHIR standard, the mediated patient matching, and you'll see there was a 1, 2, 3, 4 on here. One was basically collaborative patient matching, which we could exchange, files. Here's my list of patients. Here's your list of top health people, whatever. Collaborative patient matching, which doesn't scale at all. But mediated patient matching, and if you're, again, from a FHIR model, it's basically a patient match operation. And what you're saying, these are the pieces of information that I have, address, name, zip code, different types of things, member IDs, MRNs, member identifiers from a patient perspective, and you're able to do a patient match and basically establish almost deterministic that this is the right patient, right? So that's kind of the initial implementation that we're looking at. That's the mediated part of it. And then getting a little bit more robust in the future from a network identity management process, in which it can be baked into patient workflows and those types of things, where you get pop-ups on your phone that says, hey, are you somebody's trying to access your records, or you Patrick Berta? Yep, you're able to identify and confirm access to information. From an overall project perspective, we're basically down to a notice of intent to ballot was done. The ballot voting starts on March 1st, actually already started, and will go until May 1st of this year. So that's currently in process. Hopefully we'll get good results there, good feedback, and go through a process of reconciliation over the next several months after that. All right, Melissa, we can go ahead and go forward. I'm going to quickly walk through this, and so that we have time for questions at the end. But again, I want to reiterate, because we've got folks from a lot of different perspectives here. And I heard a couple of, HL7 accelerators mentioned on here. I believe we talked about Gravity, that was mentioned. I've talked about DaVinci a couple of times on here. Where does this fit into the overall model? So you guys are probably familiar with the functional HL7 accelerators, and they're listed on the top here. You got Karen, Vulcan, Codex, all of those. FAST provides the foundational components of what those functional use cases are able to do. What we don't want to do is for DaVinci, Gravity, Vulcan to come up with different patient matching or different security models, or anything that would limit the ability of those use cases defined within that domain to be specific from an infrastructure perspective to that domain. So build the Lego box of the core capabilities and allow the functional use case folks, of which all of us are participants there, to move that forward without reinventing the wheel every time, right? So I can tell you, as part of a member of those communities, they don't want to think about what's the security model going to look like. What is the How do we do routing across intermediaries? What's the technical capability to make that happen? They'd much rather rely on a common set of core capabilities that we can all benefit from. All right, Melissa, if we could go ahead and go forward. And I'm just going to throw these on here really quickly. And this is nothing more than a shameless, request that folks that are interested in participating in the FAST community, please come join us. The model that we're going to go through here is really as an organizational participant in the governance body. That's not the only mechanism. We've got, Fire at Scale Task Force on LinkedIn. We've got other mechanisms for engaging. So this is really geared at an organizational level, but what is the value, right? First of all, leading the strategy and the decision-making. A lot of the stuff that I just talked about is not trivial. It's been talked about for 25 years for many of us, right? So being able to lead that strategy and be the decision maker is a key thing if you have an interest in these fields. Again, providing thought leadership, that is a key thing, is influencing how we're going to move forward. And we all gain efficiencies. If we don't have to build one-off solutions for every connection that we make to identify patients or gear up security, then we all benefit from a community perspective. Next slide, please, Melissa. The overall governance model that we're planning to implement from a Fire at Scale Task Force as it moves over to the HL7 Accelerator is very similar to what we have from some of the other HL7 accelerators. As a matter of fact, we went through each one of the charters and guides to come up with one without reinventing the wheel. This probably most closely aligns with the model that we have with Da Vinci, which has been very, very beneficial, over the last 3 to 4 years, actually 5 years, because it started at the same time that we started this one. And it basically distills down to really 3 key components, right? We of course have HL7, that's there, but we have a steering committee or an executive committee and a steering committee folks that basically guide this from a overall leadership perspective, right? Typically meet monthly and are dealing with issues such as related to finance and overall, executive type of stuff. We have an operating committee, which is one level below that, that deals more with, of course, operational things. So things related to what use cases are we bringing forward? Who's leading those use cases? And do we need help? Do we need somebody to help write an implementation guide? Do we have enough volunteers? Whatever the case may be. And then on the right side, another key component is the PMO, the Program Management Office, which basically helps make sure the lights are on day to day, that we're moving forward, that artifacts are moving through the process, and those types of things. So Melissa, who is on the call here, helps with a lot of that, from a FAST perspective and other as well, to make sure that things are moving forward and that it's just not volunteer based, because those of you that have been in standards based for a while, we all volunteer our time, but at some point, you actually need folks that are dedicated to start moving things forward. Next slide, please. I'm just going to quickly go over this, to talk about, what we're doing from an overall engagement opportunities. Again, this is not meant for individuals. There are ways to engage individually, but for organizations that we're bringing to bear, because what we have found historically through the accelerated community, the broader the scope that you have from an organizational perspective, the more you can influence, the more you get thought leadership, the more you can move forward. So the different things that we have on the deck or the slide that we have here describes those different levels from premier, principal, sponsor, sponsored member. These will probably make more sense as we go to the next slide, which describes some of well, I've actually thought of a slide over this. These are the things that the funding model covers. Basically, I'm going to sum this slide up in just a couple of words here, in the sense that the FAST initiative has been driven by a volunteer community almost exclusively, with the exception of some exceptional folks like Melissa that have been providing the glue for the better part of 5 years. As these start becoming operational documents, are starting to go into the wild and becoming persistent and starting to be used, the ability to support that moves to a different level, right? Because now it becomes an ongoing concern that is more formal, needs additional governance, needs people that are staffed and able to move this forward. So we look the maintain in flight, it's basically operating on the complete volunteer model with some PMO support. The second tier there, the estimated annual cost, probably need to rename that, is basically adding some additional folks that are doing this as part of their day job to ensure that things are continuing to move forward. If we go ahead and go to the next slide, this maybe will make a little bit more sense, because these are the organizations that are actively participating. So if we look on the right side, these are folks that have committed, right? So these organizations, and that's a fairly good pedigree and a fairly good spectrum of folks that have committed it and stood up and say, we've been part of FAST before, and we're going to continue to support FAST going into the new HL7 accelerator. All right, so the folks on the right side. On the left two columns, you'll see folks that are interested, meaning they've raised their hand maybe halfway. They're not all the way up yet, but they appear to be very interested, and we're hoping to bring those across the finish line so that they become part of the HL or the FAST community as a whole. If we go ahead and jump over to the next slide, Melissa. These are some of the other organizations. We've got committed, we've got folks that are interested, and now we've got folks in the membership pipeline that we're having active conversations with. And I think this may actually be a little bit dated, meaning like a couple of days, because I think some of these folks have started to move forward from pipeline into the interested category as well. But again, you can see these are some major players as it relates to interoperability. So we are excited and honored to have some of these folks coming into our community. All right, and with that being said, I know I covered a whole lot in a short period of time. Alex, I'm going to kick it back over to you, and you can go walk us through there, and then maybe we'll have some time for questions.
Sure, I'll try to breeze through these as quickly as possible. Really, the takeaway message here is that there's a lot of different ways to get engaged with FAST. Of course, we would love to have every organization that we can join as a member of the accelerator and really help support this work. But that doesn't mean that participation in FAST is limited just to members of the accelerator. And everything that we're working on, as Patrick has essentially shared with us, is done under the auspices of HL7. So all of the implementation guides you've talked about, all of the work that we do at HL7 Connectathons, it's all public and open, and anybody can come and participate. And there are certainly no plans to exclude organizations from participating in that process. Membership is really oriented around some of the administrative activities, operational activities of the accelerator itself, participation in governance, helping to create, I guess, new projects or new work streams, probably some level of implementation support. A lot of these details have to be worked out still. If you are an organization that is able to join as a member, again, we'd love to have you. We'll talk a little bit about the process here. We've had a couple of FAST information sessions. I think we can count this one in that group as well. And we've got a whole team of people working on this transition that are available to answer any questions you have about FAST, whether you're able to participate as a member or not. Can kind of talk through membership options, what that might look like, how your organization might benefit from participating in the FAST accelerator. But again, I do want to emphasize that there's a significant amount of work that is being done in the public realm and will continue to be done in the public realm. And we definitely welcome all sorts of organizations to come and participate. I think especially from a membership perspective, we're really looking for organizations that can commit resources, whether that's financial or in kind with their personnel, to implementation of the FAST solutions. As we've moved past just the standards development activities, or really starting to move past just standards development, looking forward to implementation. We're really looking for organizations that have the time and resources that they can dedicate to testing and implementing some of this work. But again, we're always looking for feedback on the different specifications we develop, the standards that we're developing, and just the general approach and direction of FAST and the accelerator. As always, feel free to reach out to myself, to Patrick, to our support team at Point of Care Partners. If you do have any questions or want to learn more about FAST, we have a lot of people who are more than happy to do a real deep dive into the different solutions and the different work that's going on. So I highly encourage everybody to join us if or reach out if possible. Next slide. So if you are one of those organizations that is interested in joining the accelerator, we have sort of this, I guess, limited time acknowledgement of organizations that are joining as founding members. So starting March 31st, I would consider that, I guess, the official kickoff of the accelerator. That's when we're convening the first set of members that have signed up to participate in the governance process, and really to finalize some of the decisions that are still remaining around the accelerator. You know, one of those things that we'll be talking about is how we can best accommodate organizations that don't necessarily have the resources to join at a full membership level, but are still interested in participating and being active participants in the accelerator. So if you feel that you know, being a member is something that interests you, or you just want to get involved some way, shape, or form, please do reach out to us. We have a HL7 email box, fast@hl7.org. It's pretty easy. And we've definitely got people looking at that. It comes to my inbox too. So I will see every message that gets sent there, and we'll be happy to connect you to people that can answer your questions. Next slide. And again, if you're not you know, able to or interested in becoming a member of the accelerator, we do have a lot of ways that people can get engaged today. As I said, all of our meetings working on these implementation guides and the standards that Patrick described are open. You'll see here information for joining all of those meetings. We've got project pages up on HL7's Confluence site for each of the implementation guides we're working on. We've got public meetings happening pretty much every day of the week, and I highly encourage folks to join those, especially if you have more in-depth questions about the standards that we're developing, and you know, really the scope of those standards and what they're seeking to address, and also to influence the direction of those standards. As Patrick mentioned, we've taken a couple of them through ballot already, but the bulk of the work is still not balloted yet, and so there's still a lot of time to provide feedback before we go to ballot. And then, of course, for folks that are familiar with the FHIR community, chat.phir.org or the Zulip chat are the where a lot of questions and discussion happens around FHIR. And there's a lot of people that are consistently, I don't know how they do it, to be honest, but that are consistently on chat.phir.org answering questions and you know, providing really useful, valuable information, not just about FAST, but about all things FHIR. So highly encourage you to get an account on that website if you don't have one already. I know we've already taken almost all of the time that we have, but we'd be happy to stick around if there are questions. I know there's been a few in the chat. One thing I do want to mention is we're always looking for testing partners, folks that are able to implement all of or a portion of one of the FAST solutions and demonstrate that at a Connect-a-thon to provide real implementation experience and support. That's something that I think the HL7 community at large desperately needs in general, but certainly, you know, we are members of the HL7 community and would love to have organizations that are able to test our solutions. So with that, let's open it up for questions.
Thank you very much for a fire hose presentation. It's great to see the updates. And I am got some questions I want to, before I jump in, I want to see if other folks have any specific things. So let me just pause before I say something here. Okay. Well, one of the things, and one of the reasons you're interested in FHIR, obviously, is being able to reuse and to apply learning from the healthcare space into the social care space and the education space and the justice space, the housing space, many other places that are today not really fully FHIRized, if at all. And one of the things that I'm really interested in, I think a lot of people in this group are, and a lot of people in this group probably volunteer a disproportionate amount of time in standards bodies already. So what I think would be an interesting, part of the interesting question here for me at least is, how do we broker a conversation between all the work that's going on in healthcare and the work that's going outside of the healthcare space? Because there's a ton of work going on outside that needs to be able to connect to healthcare, but is not healthcare centric. And I know that there's been a lot of work going on. I think since the last presentation, I can see a lot of that work going on. But I'm looking for places where we can actually make that connection. And in a way, how do we bring our groups together in a way that we have a full voice in, as I said, education, justice, housing, all those other spaces, separate from what Gravity is doing, which is great. We need codes to be able to do billing and the like, but it's a different kind of conversation. We're talking about actually care management and case management kinds of things. So let me throw that out there for a moment, see if you have a response or thought to that.
Yeah, I can go, Alex, you could feel free to add any color commentary. I think Daniel and team, we all knew this conversation would come. We didn't know exactly when it was going to come, right? Because as we've seen fire start proliferating, not just between two actors, but actually into the DNA of organizations as data models and internal things, we knew at some point that it would grow beyond just what we consider to be classic healthcare. I think, and so some of the work that, getting SDOH from non-healthcare things has been a use case that folks have been looking at. But I think understanding, and the education one as well, maybe a little bit, but I think even understanding beyond healthcare where those intersection points may be, right? Or at least some inventory of, maybe from the folks on the call here, probably not in the next 2 minutes, but understanding what you see as use cases to make sure they overlay where what we were predicting things would go, right? Because once we get beyond the boundary of the classic healthcare ecosystem, things become a little bit fuzzy for some of us who deal mostly in the classic interop world of healthcare. So if there's a list or a place that we can go start having those discussions about, I don't know all the education use cases. I don't know, so some of the others as well. Understanding those would be really beneficial.
Hi, Patrick. Courtney Baldridge from US Aging, and I will just say my 50,000 foot lens on this is, if you're going from healthcare into the social determinants of health CBO space, buckle your seatbelt. We're a little more complicated and a lot more nuanced. And unfortunately, there are so many gradations of gray here that it's complicated, hard, and we oftentimes don't have the resources, the standardization, nor the structure. But we also do have plenty of funders, partner requirements, and other issues that further complicate the picture. Happy to have that conversation offline.
Yep. So I just want to make sure I understood, Courtney. You're saying it's more complex than healthcare? Because that's that's a little bit scary.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think so.
I think Paul's having a stroke. So yeah, in many ways, I don't mean to be humorous, but that's in many ways that's concerning. In many ways, that's, thank God you're not in the healthcare morass the rest of us are in. Maybe there is a way to start with a baseline that we could,
Well, what's interesting, at least in our network, and I will put forward our network as probably one of the more complicated in the social services side, because not only are we government funded, our folks receive other grants, they may receive local and state funding, and our government funding also does have the capacity for each state to use their own platform and decide their own data sets. So we start off at a complicated point. Our networks also, over 50% of our agencies also contract with healthcare and or MCOs. So when I say we're complicated, we're pretty darn complicated. So if you build a highway that suits us, you pretty much got it covered.
Yeah, we may have to add some lanes on that highway.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's actually interesting. You mentioned that. I remember last time we talked, I was actually following up with Stefan Konya about actually adding those lanes, because as the asphalt is drying or being laid or foundation is being laid, there are some other vehicles that are look very different than healthcare vehicles. And a lot of that has to do with unstructured data, which is the complexity in the social care world is we don't have the same values, small v values that healthcare is awash in, I would say.
Yeah, Daniel, and I remotely recall that conversation, but if there is a way to, even on the back of a napkin or whatever, or a whiteboard session in which we get from a high level what those vehicles are, because based on what Courtney was saying, these vehicles maybe, I think the overall infrastructure is there. I don't know that I said more lanes. I don't know that we really need more lanes, but understanding the dimensions of the vehicles, do they have 12 wheels as opposed to 4? Are they 24-foot wide as opposed to 8? I think is really going to be key.
And Patrick, I would say all of the above, and occasionally you're going to see somebody riding a bike down the highway.
That's right.
In the middle of all that traffic.
Right.
So, understand we've got some of the biggest, most sophisticated vehicles out there, but we also have some really disturbing folks that should not be riding down your highway, all needing to play and all entering it at different places with different capacities and with different challenges.
Which is why we started IXFIS, was to help those poor folks on a bicycle get into a bike lane and maybe slap an electric motor on the darn thing.
Or at least put a helmet on, Brian.
Yeah, I think one of the complexities is to extend this metaphor is different traffic laws, right? It's one of the relatively, I guess, simple things about healthcare is that we can fall under treatment payment operations, hit the whole HIPAA construct, and without that framework to rest on, I think it's a little bit more complicated when we start talking about technical infrastructure and architecture. And there's certainly different things that we'll need to consider, different capabilities that we'll need to consider, and definitely look forward to that conversation as well.
Well, and Alex, one of the things I have said in other groups is that you have to know and understand, at least in aging, I represent the aging end of the world, that because you have legacy systems like the Older Americans Act that has been on the ground for 47 years, even if you go to align the systems and the data and configure that piece out, you need to know and understand the actual services that are being provided on the ground have been influenced and instructed by the past. And what that means is currently, a ride in Ohio is defined differently than a ride in Florida, both for the definition of the ride, the attributes of the ride, the training, the certification and credentialing of the ride, and the price point of the ride. So even if you change everything else, you might not necessarily be able to impact the actual service that's provided, and how does it align, and what is the data able to reflect? Are we just going to have an edited version of the data because we did that conveniently to make it all align, so that we never really know and understand what's happening out there? Or can we make it work? So there's some real impact and domino issues that I perceive and see as we kind of try to work through this process.
Yeah,
the context is super important of any piece of information that's exchanged. And I think that speaks to the role that humans will play in enabling this work, and it will not just be all automated, because you lose some of that context and nuance.
I might add also, one of the recent conversations we had, actually Stefan was on, and we've had a couple of conversations with Mickey and Steve Posnick around that. One of the first slides you put up, which shows that whole process, and it said, consent goes here. Well, that's that box that we're actually working on. One of the things that this group is working on is that, what does that consent mean where is it obtained? How is it obtained? Not only from a healthcare of HIPAA consent, but the other ones that are also relevant to people's important lives. And so that's what we're actually, one of the things we're actually focused on, which is the place we ought to be talking ongoing, Alex, because a FERPA consent versus a 42 CFR versus a housing or a state code also need to be considered as we're looking at the exchange of information, because healthcare may only be one small part of the overall equation or the overall coordinated care model that we're working with a family or an individual on. And that, again, because things tend to be, because healthcare tends to be the 800, well, the $4 trillion gorilla in the budget. Forget the billions, let's go to trillions. The other things tend to get sort of squashed. And yet those are the things that are going to keep people out of the hospital and potentially healthier and, sort of receiving less services. But that's a different mindset of where the data is. How do we do that crosswalk? One of the things that Brian and Matt and others have been around is just what is that ontological, sort of crosswalk between the fire, stuff and, justice has a very robust, set of standards for working with people, who are in jail or in probation, or how do they, how do we blend those and make sure that we're able to sort of facilitate the communication?
Well, and Daniel, I'm seeing Rita's comment about, the challenge with defining what a service is and a program, and how are those represented as a resource, potentially in a resource directory.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you, a lot of our folks, as an example of some of the problems that exist on aligning this highway or being able to sit on the highway properly, a lot of our folks use LA 211 or AIRS as their taxonomy. Not all, but most. However, they use that for INR. They do not use that for data capture. So there is a huge disconnect that sits right there in terms of what they're using for INR versus what they're using to capture the work they're actually doing.
Yeah. So, well, I think we're actually in a double overtime here again. So I want to acknowledge and appreciate your contribution here, Alex. And I think that is an area that I know ONC has interest in, and I know that we the conversations are started, more than started. We're looking at actually integrating some of this work into it. So how that happens, along the way here is going to be an interesting and I think an important conversation, especially as the S2H work gets further and further embedded in legislation and activities in Congress and in budgets and then people actually doing stuff. We're going to need to really bring these parties together in a way that sort of recognizes the other vehicles on the road or that need to be on the road. And so I hope that we can sort of continue to do that as we go forward here.
Daniel, one more thing I'd like for everyone to think about as they go forward is with all these vehicles on the road between healthcare and the social determinant of health organizations that manage that, what is the appropriate entree point? I mean, who should be, historically, social services has done information referral, but they're also the ones doing the assessment so they can properly assess the client to move them through to care plans, intervention, service provision. And I think that becomes a critical part of this information exchange and handoffs, because we would maintain in the social service world and for others that are in this world that assessments done through automated means oftentimes don't contribute to a high quality, complex care, person-centered outcome. So how can you properly manage that, and how should those referrals and handoffs be made? So I want to put that out there because I think that's critically important for you all in your roles to think about as you go forward.
And Daniel, just one additional thought here is, I think one of the challenges that we have is with these meetings being once every 2 years, the form is just doesn't have the cadence to, there's got to be a different cadence to actually start moving this forward. Alex, I don't know if that's what you were hinting at as well, but I don't know that, I don't know if there is one, or do we need to consider creating one, but I don't want to come back in 2 years and say, hey, yeah, we talked about those highways 2 years ago, you know?
Exactly. No, I think that's true. Alex, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but you know, we've been
No, I absolutely agree. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no specific thoughts. So I definitely agree with that comment. It's every 2 years is certainly not soon enough.
Oh yeah, no, and I don't want to misrepresent it. We have been, you know, actively ringing the ONC doorbell, and you know, folks have been involved. They're participating in the calls. We're trying to integrate. We're trying to sort of push this or pull this along into things that are already in flight, like the integrated care for kids programs or the moms programs, or picking up on the LEAP CDS work. Really looking at integrating, you know, that work is great on the healthcare side, and it's got great, you know, great opportunities. We have ways to actually implement that. One of the major areas, as I said, maybe we ought to share with you some of the work on the consent work, is around consent, because our belief is if you can get the consent up front, all the other stuff is doable. But without it, especially on the social care side, you're not making any progress. Not going to happen. So maybe what we ought to do is sort of make sure we're syncing up on that, because we're hopefully being able to go into some actual implementation proof of concepts this year that look at not only the social care, but the healthcare and some of the education, justice, WIC, SNAP, housing things, those use cases as represented by the various different programs. So there's actually a lot of work going on right now that, again, left hand, right hand, you know, there's so many things going on in the country that knowing what's actually happening is, you know, part of our work is to make sure we're connecting the dots here. Because
but Daniel, even one of the things we need to recognize, some of the patterns that we've already developed as part of the functional use cases in healthcare could be reused. For example, the consent model. For example, that when we solved the you know, CMS 9115 payer to payer, that was a new model for us. And we now have to capture consent up front from a member to get data from another payer. So we created a FHIR consent assertion, capturing the consent any way you want, putting it in a FHIR object, and then passing that around. So anyway, I don't want to get into technical details, but reusing that which has been thought through could be something critical for you.
Absolutely. And those are the areas that we're trying to make sure we do. And that's why our participation in Gravity at the technical levels and various different fast scripts and stuff like that is critical. You know, work, I just put in a link here to the national scan we did on consent. And, you know, there certainly are some promising models. I don't think we saw anything that really addresses again, what Courtney so eloquently described as the different requirements, again, for education, justice, healthcare, not healthcare, social care. And so we are absolutely dedicated to, you know, identity management, authentication, you know, all those things as best we can take advantage of those. We certainly want to do that. And that will only happen by sort of further education of what's going on out there and being privy to those successful practices and how do they translate. All right. Well, I think this has been great. There's a ton of stuff here. We'll be posting the video to the Nick site, so for folks to play it back at half speed, so we can really grab onto many of the concepts. I want to thank you, Patrick and Alex, for coming on, making time for this conversation. And I am sure we will be back at you to figure out ways to move forward on this work in the next, in the not too distant future, if not sooner than that. And we'll see folks back here next week. Thanks so much for participating today. Everyone have a great end of the day. Talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Here,